listen-only mode.
Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to this inaugural Excel Community webinar, Practical Uses of Excel Pivot Tables. My name is Richard Anning. I'm the head of the IT faculty here at ICAEW, and it is my pleasure to guide you through the next 60 minutes. This is the first in a series of quarterly webinars presented exclusively for members of the Excel community. We hope you find the session useful and will be able to apply many of the techniques that you will learn today. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to listen to again 24 hours after the session ends, in case you want to go back and revise the learning points from the next hour. This first webinar is being given by Simon Hurst, Chartered Accountant, previous chairman of the IT faculty and Excel guru. For me, what marks Simon out as unique amongst Excel trainers is his understanding of the needs of the accountant, combined with his knowledge of spreadsheets and particularly Excel. This gives him the ability to hone in on what matters to accountants, as well as the ability to explain concepts and answers to accountants in a language that they understand. Simon runs a regular roadshow for the faculty, bringing him face-to-face with members and their Excel issues. This deepens his understanding of their needs, as well as providing input for his popular blogs and articles for the Excel community. The timings for this morning, we are hoping that Simon will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes for questions at the end. We can continue the discussion and debate on the Excel community after the event. Before I hand over to Simon, I just want to let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a control panel, and you can increase this or decrease this with this red item here. At the bottom of the control panel, you will see a section called Questions. If you expand that section by clicking on the icon, which is to the right-hand side of the word Questions, you will see a white box. During the presentation, you can send questions to Simon. Simply type in your question and click Send. It's a bit like MSN Instant Messenger for those of you who have used that before. We've allowed time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. If we don't have time to get through everyone's questions today, we'll go through them after the webinar has ended and make sure that we get the answers posted onto the Excel Community Forum. And what we're going to do is you can ask questions as we go through the session, but we will take questions at the end after Simon is finished. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Simon. So Simon.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for fighting your way through the mist and fog to be here this morning. I'm going to start off just by asking which version of Excel everybody's using. So hopefully if I launch a poll here, then excellent. Gosh, that worked well. So just wait a few seconds for a few more answers to come in. So there's a few 2003 users out there, and a very brave user of an earlier version who's prepared to admit to that. It's good. Otherwise, pretty evenly split 2010, 2007. Good. That's probably enough. I'll be using, as you can probably see, I'll be using 2010 for today's webinar. Where there are significant differences between 2010 and 2007, and particularly 2003 and earlier, I will try and highlight those. Pivot tables has changed quite a bit, particularly from 2003 to 2007, and there are certainly some compatibility issues if you're creating pivot tables in the later version and trying to share them with the earlier version. I'm going to try and cover a whole range of pivot table items, from just straightforward why would anybody use a pivot table, through to some more complicated areas, including some that are specific to the later versions. Hopefully, if you have got an earlier version, then this might give you some idea of what the advantages are in upgrading sometime. And I'm going to start off, rather than by talking a lot about pivot tables, just by doing one, because hopefully that demonstrates how simple pivot tables can be, and the sort of thing that you can achieve with them. Hopefully, what I'm about to do is to transform a block of about 2,000 rows of data, which, as 2,000 rows of data is perhaps not all that meaningful, into a league table of salespeople in, I think, 11 clicks, although being an accountant will say materially somewhere between 9 and 13 clicks. So here I've got a set of data, and I think one of the first issues when you're working with pivot tables in Excel is to make sure the data is suitable for turning into a pivot table. Pivot tables work with very raw, unformatted data, and I think a lot of people have issues with pivot tables because the initial data they're working with isn't suitable. It's either not consistent or it's pre-formatted. So one of the first things to do is to establish that you've got the right set of data. This set of data here is actually the invoices table from the Microsoft Access sample database Northwind. So if you've got Office Professional and you've got, as a result, the Microsoft Access application, you should have the Northwind database as a sample database. They use it for all the help screens within Access. So if you wanted to try any of this yourselves, you should be able to get at exactly this data. So this is the invoices table. It's quite a big table of data. We've got all sorts of things, the customer's name, we've got country, salesperson, order ID, order date, various other dates, product name, and importantly, something to add up over on the right-hand side, we've got the extended price, the value of the order. So we're going to judge how well our salespeople are doing just really by how much they've sold. Fairly one-dimensional test, but it helps show what pivot tables do. So I've clicked anywhere in my big table of data, and in 2010 I can go to the Insert menu and click on Pivot Table over here on the left-hand side, and that should select my table of data. You'll see that this is an Excel 2010 table. Tables have names, and it's chosen the name of the table, and it's selected the whole area. In 2003, it should just have selected a range of cells. I'm going to put the pivot table on a new worksheet, so all I need to do is to click OK. If anybody's counting, I think I'm up to 3. Now here we have quite a significant difference if you're used to 2003. In 2003, you would have a pivot table area, you would have a field list with the names of the individual fields, which are your column headings from your table of data. But in 2003, you would drag the fields to the different parts of your pivot table to turn it into a summary table. 2007-2010, that has changed. We now have the different areas of our pivot table shown as a schematic underneath our field list, and we can drag the items to these areas, or we can just select the items and Excel will guess where we want to put them. So what I'm hoping to achieve is a league table of salespeople. So I'll go down and choose salesperson. And because salesperson is a text field, Excel knows it's not going to be able to add it up easily, so it automatically assumes I want it as a label and sticks it in the row labels area. And we can see over on our actual table, we now have a list of salespeople. We want to know how much they've sold, so we'll go down to the extended price and select that. and that is a value, so Excel automatically sticks it in the values area. So now, just with those, I've lost count, but however many clicks we're up to, we've now summarized our 2,000 odd lines by salesperson. Just quickly, I'm going to switch across to 2003 just to show you the difference. So over here in 2003, hopefully you can see that. This is what 2003 would look like. Pretty much the same, but we can drag our items to the appropriate positions rather than having the schematic down the bottom. So back to 2010, and we've got our list here. Perhaps at the moment it's not wonderfully useful because our salespeople are shown in alphabetical order, so we'd have to sort of trawl through to try and work out what the highest number is, and finding out the highest number isn't helped by the number format having those 1,000 separators and including pence. So we'll try and address both of those. First of all, we'll try and sort out the sort order. So I'm going to right-click on a salesperson, and I have an option sort and more sort options. Slightly different in 2003. You'd go into the settings and advanced sort options to get to the same place. We'll use more sort options. And here, rather than sorting either A to Z, ascending or descending, we're going to choose descending, and we're going to choose sum of extended price so that we show our list with those who've sold the most at the top. Click on OK, and our list is now sorted, and we can see that our top salesperson by amount sold is Margaret Peacock. Just going to adjust the number format. Again, similar in 2003, just slightly different options from the right-click menu. I'm going to right-click and choose number format, and I'll choose a custom format with 1,000 separators, no pence, and negatives in red with brackets. And now that gives me a much neater format by doing it that way, rather than selecting a group of cells and applying a format. By right-clicking and choosing number format, that changes the format for all the values in that area of the pivot table. So now with those 11 clicks, I think it was about 11, we've transformed 2,000 odd rows of data that perhaps are quite difficult to make much sense of into our league table of salespeople, showing us who's sold the most. So at the moment, we've only used two areas of our pivot table. We've used the values area, and we've used the row labels area. Incidentally, it's probably worth mentioning, because this does come up quite a lot, that if you put something in the values area and Excel counts it rather than adding it up, that's generally because you've got a non-numeric field or a null or something strange in your list of values, and Excel can't decide whether it can add it up, so it counts it instead. You can look at the field settings. There's various ways of getting to this, but you can change the field settings to sum rather than count, but it might be as well to just check the underlying data to see why Excel didn't think it could add it up in the first place. So we've used two of our areas. Now let's use some of the other areas, and this time, instead of just clicking, I'm going to drag the country field, because I don't want it to be a row label where it would end up by default. I want it to be a column label. So I'm going to drag country to column labels, and now we have a grid showing sales by salesperson by country. And I've got one area left, which is my report filter. I'm going to take my product name, stick that in the report filter, and now I could choose a particular product. What should we have? Let's have escargot. And that filters my table to show me just sales of escargot. In 2007-2010, I have this select multiple items option. If I turn that on, then I can choose several items at a time. Notice that at the moment, with only one item selected, I can see what that item is. If I choose several items, all my pivot table tells me is that I've chosen multiple items. And we'll have a look at a potential answer to that towards the end. Right, so we've had a look at building in a bit of interactivity with the filter area. We can do more, so we can move things around. So at the moment we've got salesperson as the row label, country as the column label. I can swap that around, so I can just drag salesperson to the column area, drag country to the row area to pivot, hence I guess the name, the table round, show it in a different way. I can also have multiple items in the same area. So if I drag both salesperson and country to the row area, I now have a subtotal of salesperson within each country. If I want that the other way around, so I want country within salesperson, I can just change the position of salesperson and country, and the pivot table reflects that. Right, let me now just remove country. So if I just drag that out of the whole area, that will just be removed from my pivot table, but it's obviously still available in my field list if I want to bring it back. And at the moment, it's all very well trying to establish who our best salesperson is, but we haven't looked at when they've made the sales. They might not have made a sale for a year or so. I'll just clear my settings. So I've got my full list there, so I've cleared my filter. And I'm going to now bring in a date field. So I'm going to add the order date field as a column label. And let me just leave that there. So this is how it would appear, ungrouped. We can see that we've got a column for every individual day, which in a lot of cases wouldn't be what we want. We're going to have a look at how we might group that into a more useful total, say monthly, maybe yearly. And we do that just by right-clicking on one of those dates. And we have a group option. You can select group, and you can see here that I can choose different grouping periods, depending on the type of data, anywhere from seconds to years. I'm going to just choose months and years, so I'm going to group by months and years. And now my data is grouped as I've asked it to be. I have a separate years field. My order date is now monthly, so I can see my sales by month within each year. It's worth mentioning, just as with adding something to the values area and it being counted rather than summed, if you can't group something like a date, so when you click on group and it says can't group that selection, that's normally because there's something in that field that Excel doesn't recognize as a date. It's an incorrect date, like a non-leap year, 29th of February, the absence of a date, something like that. And that prevents it from grouping. So again, you'd need to go back to your data and try and sort it out so everything was a valid date. Now, we've effectively created an extra field here. So we've got a years field that we didn't have before. What I'm going to do is to drag that across to the report filter area. So we're now just showing our sales by month. And I could go to my years field and I could choose a particular year. Sorry, this particular copy of the Microsoft data is a little bit aged. And now I'm just looking at the figures for a particular year. Once again, I could swap things around. So I could maybe get rid of order date, bring years in as a column heading, and now I can see sales by year, and I can see the trend of different salespeople's sales. Let's clear the grouping. So I'm going to ungroup again to go back to showing things by day. and I'm going to, this time, group by weeks. So to do that, I'm going to choose days, turn off months, and say that there are 7 days in a week. That would give me a grouping by weeks, as we can see here, but as I'm sure all of you have spotted, the 4th of August 1994 is in fact a Wednesday. So what I might want to do is to set my starting position to be Monday the 2nd of August 1994, and then I get my weeks correctly running from Monday to Sunday. So that's using the built-in grouping feature. Let's just remove order date, and we'll look at our salesperson list. It's also possible to conduct ad hoc groupings of pivot table data. So I've got my salespeople here, and perhaps I want to break them down into different regions, and that information isn't in the original data that I'm working with. So it's not easy for me to derive the regions from the original data as a field over here. I can create an ad hoc grouping of these salespeople. So I can select some. So let me select that group of 3 there. I can right-click and choose group, and that then groups my salespeople into different groups. I've set up some groups here, so we don't need to go through them all, but you can set up one group, and then you can select others and select different groups. Now at the moment it's not very helpful. They're called group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. So let's just click on group 1. We'll call that North. Click on group 2. We'll call that South, East, and for completeness, West. Now that grouping is then available to me. So over here you'll see I now have a row label salesperson 2. I can use that as a column label, so I can now have totals for each of those ad hoc groups that I've set up. So that's some of the pivot table basics. Pretty much works with all versions of Excel that are in current use. I'm now going to look at some areas that are specific to the later versions, 2007 and then on to 2010. So it's a bit of a big jump from what we've done so far, but hopefully up till now I've sort of explained why pivot tables, the useful things they do, how easy it is to use them. I'm now going to show some of the perhaps more advanced uses that you can put a pivot table to. So I'm just going to swap my pivot table round slightly. I'm going to remove the salesperson 2 and bring in the country. So I've got a pivot table showing me my list of salespeople and my list of countries. And I'm going to apply conditional formatting to the pivot table. Before I do that, in order that I've got some positive and some negative numbers to work with, I'm going to demonstrate another feature of pivot tables, which is the ability to change how the actual value is displayed. At the moment, we've just been summing the value, the total of the value. There's all sorts of different things we can do with that value. I'm going to go to Show Values As, and as you can see, I could show them as percentages of the rows, of the columns. But I'm actually going to go to the Difference From option, and I'm going to show the values as the difference from Andrew Fuller. So I'll choose Andrew Fuller, show the difference from Andrew Fuller, and you'll now see that all of my figures are now not just the totals, but the difference from the figure from our benchmark salesperson, Andrew Fuller. Obviously, his row is blank as his differences would be 0. I'm going to choose any cell and I'm going to apply a conditional format. In 2010 that's on home, conditional formatting. In 2003 it's format conditional formatting. Anybody who hasn't yet seen 2007, 2010 but has used conditional formatting has been greatly enhanced in 2007 and 2010. Not only is it much easier to apply conditional formatting, you don't have to set all the rules up manually, there are various built-in rules you can adapt quite easily. The limit of only 3 rules on a set of data is not in existence anymore. Plus, you've got the different graphical presentations added in 2007 and then extended in 2010. You've got data bars. In 2007, you only had the gradient data bars with the wishy-washy ends. You've now got solid fill data bars, which are a bit more definite. We've got color scales, often called a heat map, are very useful for working with very big chunks of data where it helps to show patterns. Or you've got icon sets. Again, there's a few more here in 2010 than there were in 2007, where you can apply different icons to different cells depending on the values. The whole purpose of conditional formatting is to format a cell conditional upon the value in that cell or surrounding cells. I'm going to go for data bars. Now this is going to look pretty stupid because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a solid red data bar, but I'm only applying it to a single cell. Usually if you have data bars you apply it to a whole block of cells and it then compares the cells, and the bigger the value, the wider the bar. Applying it to a single cell, I obviously just get one long bar. But when I accept that setting, you'll see that the Excel Smart tag appears, and I can click on that and I can choose to extend my conditional formatting to all the cells in the same area of the pivot table. Now this is the big difference between 2003, 2007, 2010. In 2003 it was quite difficult to apply conditional formatting to a pivot table because conditional formatting applied to just areas of cells. And given that pivot tables, as we've seen, are very dynamic, you can move things around, the area of the pivot table changes. That made it quite difficult to work with conditional formatting in a pivot table. In 2007, it's easy now to extend your conditional formatting to the entire area of the pivot table and also to exclude the totals, which would obviously change the length of the bars. So I've not included the totals here. So here I've got my pivot table with my conditional formatting. I can be a bit more specific about how I want that conditional formatting to appear. So what I'm going to do now is to go down to my Manage Rules option. Here's my rule I've set up, just the one at the moment. I'm going to go to Edit Rule. This brings me onto the detailed rule settings. I'm going to change from a slightly pinkish red there to a nice vibrant red. I'm also going to specifically set a color for negative values. So I'm going to set negative values as black. So I've got positives as red, negatives as black, and I can choose where the axis is between positive and negative. I'm going to set that to the cell midpoint. Click on OK, and OK again. And I've now got my cells here. Let me just click outside the pivot table so the field list disappears, and you can see the conditional formatting applied to everything. I guess some of you are thinking that's all very well, but it's quite hard to see some of the numbers now. So because the numbers are so important, what I'm going to do is to go back to conditional formatting, choose Manage Rules, edit my rule, and choose to show the bar only. And what that should do is to get rid of the distracting numbers. So now we just see our pivot table as effectively a diagram using conditional formatting to show the values compared to Andrew Fuller's value. As we've said, one of the benefits of 2007, 2010 is applying conditional formatting to the area of the pivot table rather than a set of cells. So I could do something like just choose, let's get rid of them all, just choose a few countries, and we should see that the conditional formatting is applied just to the area that I want. And if I were to go back and choose everything again, then it's reapplied to the whole area. So that's a change that happened in 2007. There's another very significant change to pivot tables that occurred between 2007 and 2010, and this was the introduction of a brand new feature called Power Pivot. I'll just go and turn on Power Pivot. So Power Pivot isn't part of Excel, it's a separate downloadable add-in. You can get it from www.powerpivot.com, and when you install it, you'll find that you have a new tab on your Excel ribbon that contains the Power Pivot tools. Now, I think Microsoft still describe Power Pivot as a trial version. Any of you who've been following the history of Power Pivot, you may know that Power Pivot developed from something called Project Gemini, which was Microsoft's business intelligence project for Excel. And Microsoft described this whole area as self-service business intelligence. So here we're going to look at using pivot tables maybe as the source for perhaps a dashboard style analysis of our data. You don't need Power Pivot to do that. You could do that with normal pivot tables, but Power Pivot does extend what pivot tables does quite substantially. And it extends it in quite a few different ways. So if I launch the Power Pivot window, we can see here that one of the additional features of Power Pivot compared to normal pivot tables is the ability to bring in data from a whole range of different areas. So here in this example, I've linked my data directly to some database data. When we were looking at normal pivot tables, I just used a table within Excel. I should have mentioned then that I could equally as well have used the feature, the Get External Data feature, to link my Excel pivot table directly to the database data, and there are a lot of advantages in doing that, from the ability to automatically refresh the data through to the reduction in the likelihood of error because I don't have more than one copy of my data. And in Power Pivot, I could link the Power Pivot window to several different data sources, which wouldn't be so practical in a previous version of pivot tables. The other big advantage, or one of the other big advantages with Power Pivot, is the sheer scale of data that you can link to. Microsoft claim that you can link to hundreds of millions of rows of data. I've tried it with a couple of million. I haven't tried it with 100 million, but it did work with a couple of million. One thing I would say is that it is, if you have lots of data, it uses quite a lot of resource, particularly memory. And you can find that sometimes it will behave in unexpected ways. Quite often what you need to do is to close down Excel and reopen it to clear the memory, and then it will work. But as I say, it is currently treated as a trial version. For me, I think Power Pivot is perhaps one of the most significant changes in Excel in recent years, because it combines the power of cells and of pivot tables with the features and structure of databases. So one of the things you can do with Power Pivot is not just bring tables of data in, but having brought tables of data in, they show up as separate tabs down here. And you can create the relationships between different tables of data in the same way that you could using a simple desktop database. So if you've got multiple sources of data and you'd like to be able to create reports based on items from those different sources linking together, then you should be able to achieve that with Power Pivot. The other thing you can do with Power Pivot is it comes with a completely new set of functions. So it has a thing called data analysis expressions, or DAX. And a lot of the new DAX expressions, you probably won't notice a great deal of difference. Some of them look very similar, if not identical, to the Excel equivalent. So here, if I wanted a year field, I could use the year function and refer to my order date, and you'll see that it creates a structured formula and automatically applies that to the whole column. So it has more structure than simply changing cells in Excel. If I were to look at the full list of expressions, there's a whole new series of particularly date-related expressions in DAX that you can use to extend what you can do with a pivot table. I won't go into that in a great deal of detail. For the moment, let's just assume I've got my data here, and what I want to do is to quickly create a report, and maybe that report is going to be the basis of a dashboard style presentation of my data. So I'm going to choose to create 4 charts from my set of data. I'll stick it on a new worksheet, and now we'll find out whether I've used up too much memory. So here I've got my 4 pivot charts created from my data. I've used the same data. I've linked directly to the same data we were using earlier, but this time I've linked directly to the database. And similar technique to that I used before, I ought to be able to say, okay, let's choose country and extended price. Let's now go to my next chart and choose product name and try it again. So what you need to do in this case is, that's got country working. Let's just see if we can do another one. As I said, sometimes you do need to restart to make it work properly, which is why it's always a good idea to have a Blue Peter version kicking around. So over here, we have a bit further on, or not at all. Oh, and it was all going so well. So over here we have our finalized version. Now the difference here, the bit that wasn't working, what I've got here is I've used these things called slices. So here are my 4 charts that I was trying to create before Power Pivot ran out of resources. But in addition to creating my 4 charts, just by clicking the item I want to chart and the extended price for each one, I've also added some of my fields to this area here, the slices area, and I can have either horizontal or vertical slices. And slices are new in 2010, and they're similar to the report filter area, but as you can see, they're more visual. So when you do select multiple countries, so you can select a country, hold down Control, and select other countries, or you can use Shift, all the various means of selecting multiple items in Excel. Also, if you've got more than one slicer, then each slicer reflects the changes you've made in the other slicer. So if there are no sales in Argentina, Canada, Belgium and Germany, then as we scroll down towards the bottom of the customers, you'll see that the customers that have no sales in those areas are greyed out. So we know there are no sales for those customers. The other very significant thing about pivot table, about slicers and the way this works, is that a slicer can now be connected to multiple pivot tables. So if I right-click on a slicer and go to pivot table connections, I can attach my slicer to multiple pivot tables. So when I choose something in my slicer, it changes the criteria in all of the underlying pivot tables. Here are the sheets containing the underlying pivot tables. These charts are based on those pivot tables, so that by making a single change here, that then changes my dashboard. Obviously this is a very simple dashboard style presentation. It could be much more complex, but I'm able to build in interactivity without using any Visual Basic code or anything particularly difficult. So that's the main presentation. One thing that I think I promised in the notes that I would cover, which I will just show you briefly, is the issue of consolidations. So the first point to make about consolidations is in 2007 and 2010, when you do insert pivot table, you'll see that the options you get are to use a table or range in Excel or to use an external data source. Now, if you're a 2003 user or were a 2003 user, you may remember that there are two additional options in 2003. That's to use an existing pivot table or to use multiple consolidation ranges. And those options clearly aren't visible there. There's a couple of ways of getting back to them, and one of them involves effectively closing your eyes. In 2007-2010, there are no underlined accelerator key letters. So if we just switch back to 2003 briefly, you could get at the pivot table wizard, which has those additional options, by doing Alt-D to use the accelerator letter D for data, and then P for pivot table and pivot chart report, which would bring up, if I just do it in a blank bit, will bring up the wizard with our multiple consolidation ranges or another pivot table option in it. Now in 2007, just cancel that, and 2010, although there is no underlined D, if you do Alt-D, it recognizes the old sequence, and when you press P, it then brings up the pivot table and pivot chart wizard anyway, so you have access to multiple consolidation ranges. That then lets you add your different ranges to create a consolidation. Now, consolidated pivot tables have, I think, a fairly specialized use. They're not much good for having lots of different big blocks of data and then trying to do a pivot table based on the sum of all those blocks of data, because they really only let you summarize by one column. Where a consolidated pivot table can be useful is to do something like a simple consolidation. So here we've got a Europe sheet, an America sheet, and a UK sheet, and we want to do some sort of dynamic consolidation of that data. We can do that by using that consolidated range option, create our ranges, and then that will enable us to show our consolidation. If I just change this to all, we then should see our three tables of data brought into our total. Obviously, this was a pretty quick run through of a whole range of features in pivot tables. I hope there was the odd bit and piece useful for people, whatever levels of expertise or whatever versions. I do some, as Richard mentioned at the beginning, some roadshows for the IT faculty, and it's relatively short notice. There's a detailed pivot table roadshow coming up next Monday afternoon, I think, in Chartered Accountants Hall in London, called More Power to Your Pivot, that does all this and then goes into a great deal more detail and looks at some of the more complex aspects. I'll now just see if anybody's still there. Oh, yeah. Most of you. Good. Thank you for your attention. I think I'm now handing back over to Richard, who will see if there's any questions that I can help anybody with. Richard, are you there?
I am indeed, yes. Just waiting for the screen to come up. Many thanks for that, Simon. That was a fascinating view of pivot tables and then power pivot at the end there. Can you do me a favour, Simon, and change presenter back to Lisa and myself? Okay. I think you need to change to Lisa rather than to me, Simon. Sorry about that.
Sorry?
If you can change presenter to Lisa rather than to me.
Hopefully that's done.
Yeah. Right. So we're just going to run through. Right, here we go. So if I could just remind people out there who are still with us to ask questions. If you go to the question box on the right-hand side of the screen, you can type questions in there, and then we can give them to Simon. We have a comment rather than a question from Daniel, who's commenting on the presentation, the webinar format. So thank you for that, Daniel. It's a comment rather than a question, and that's great. We have a question here from Hannah. How do you change the default pivot table that comes up? For example, so that it shows grid lines, because the default one in 2007 Excel doesn't have grid lines.
I think there's no easy way to change the default, but there is on the pivot table ribbon. Yes, because I can't demonstrate because we're looking at that screen. On the pivot table ribbon, there's a whole series of layout options, which, with pretty much a single click, you can choose your different approaches for your pivot table. So on the pivots, when you're in a pivot table in 2007, 2010, you have two contextual tabs, two ribbon tabs that only appear when you're working with a pivot table. One of them is options, one of them is design. On the design, then you can just choose a different style with a single click, either to include grid lines or not to include grid lines. It may well be that there is a means of setting it to the default, but it's not something I've found yet.
Okay, thank you for that, Simon. We have had one question that says, are there any notes? There are no notes as such. We can put these simple presentation screens up on the community. However, the presentation will be made available as a recording 24 hours after the end of the webinar. So hopefully people can come back and refer to it again and again. And as Simon said, there's a more detailed session that he's giving in London next week. So I hope that answers that question. Okay. There's another couple of questions coming through. One from Stephen. When you add columns, the heading defaults to sum of XXX, and you need to change manually. Is there any way to exclude the sum of?
Not that I know of. Obviously manually, as Stephen says, but I don't know of any way of stopping it do that in the first place.
Okay, Simon, thanks for that. There's another one. How is it possible to sort row labels alphabetically or numerically?
Is that where you've got multiple different fields in the row label area, or where you're sorting the items within the row label. If it's just the items within the row label, then it should be just a simple question of various ways of doing it, but just you can right click and choose sort, and then you've got sort A to Z, sort Z to A. I think if you've got multiple row label items, I think you just have to drag them to the position you want.
Okay, Simon, that's helpful. I appreciate it's difficult for you as well, not having the system up there to maybe show it, but thanks for that description there. Are there any other questions that attendees have for Simon? If you could put those in now.
Also, if I come up with any answers, I think I'm going to be just writing a short sort of introduction to the webinar when it goes online. If I do find any answers to questions that I didn't know at the time, or I suddenly think of an answer, I'll try and add that into the either as a comment or as part of the article. So if you did ask a question and I didn't have a brilliant answer, then do check back and see if I've come up with one.
Thanks. Yes, all the questions that are being asked by attendees, they're all being recorded, so we can go through them after. There's a question from Nicholas about the spreadsheet and whether that's going to be available. I don't know if that's. I know it's a massive spreadsheet. I don't know your thoughts there, Simon.
I think, to be honest, there wouldn't be any particular problem making the basic spreadsheet available. It really just takes the Northwind data and does a few things to it. So it may be that I think the second part of that question is detailed instructions as to how to pull the data together. It may be that I could do those instructions, because then people could pretty much create the spreadsheet for themselves. So it wouldn't be a big issue to put that together. So I'm sure I could try and do that.
Okay, thank you, Simon. There's a question here. Once you have a pivot, I sometimes want to apply a formula which references the results returned in the pivot, but the formula always stays as a fixed cell reference. Is there a way around this?
I assume what's happening is when you create your formula, you're pressing equals and then clicking on the cell within the pivot table. If you do that, then by default what happens is it uses a special function called getPivotData. And that function hard codes the things like, in my case, the salesperson name, the year, whatever the coordinates of that cell are. It hard codes those into this getPivotData function. Now there are two ways around that, and actually it's a very good question, because it's an area that I cover in quite a lot of detail in the actual course. You can either change the hard coding in the getPivotData function to refer to particular cells, so that you can just change the value in the cell and then the total will be for the salesperson whose name you've typed, and you can also use data validation to make that name selectable from a list. Or you can, if you really want just a reference to E11 or whatever the cell happens to be, if you just type it in, so if you just type in equals E11, then it will create it as a reference to E11, and then you could drag that down to E12, E13, and so on. If that was something you wanted to do a lot and you really don't want to use the getPivotData function, then there is an option somewhere within Excel's options where you can turn off the use of getPivotData totally, so that when you do equals and you click, then it will still just use a straightforward cell reference.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much for that. Are there any final questions for Simon before we wrap up the session? No? Oh, okay, thanks. We have another comment there from Tricia. Thanks for that, Tricia. Okay, let's go on to the wrap up now. And as it says there, thanks for attending. I hope that you're much more familiar with the power and capabilities of Excel pivot tables after this webinar. I certainly know that I am. The recording of the webinar presentation and the Q&A will be available shortly. They will be made available on the Excel community pages and also at ICAEW.com/Excel. We'd be very grateful if you could tell us what you think. Please tell us how useful you found this webinar. A survey will be sent to you shortly. If you have any questions, please email us at excel@icaew.com, and there's also a telephone number up there as well. You can also raise questions and continue the discussion on the Excel community website. The next Excel Community Training webinar is Minimizing Spreadsheet Errors on the 8th of December at 10:30. This will be presented by Ewan Ferguson, Director at Risk Management Experts Productivity. Ewan gave the launch presentation for the Excel community back in June. And as mentioned a couple of times, don't forget there is still time to register for Simon's afternoon presentation on the 3rd of October. More power to your pivot, practical uses for Excel pivot tables. This is a slightly longer in-depth presentation. It takes place at Chartered Accountants Hall from 1:30 p.m. to 5:15 p.m. So many thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.